The comic book adaptation of Rogue One is a moderate success. The inclusion of deleted scenes add to the narrative and recontextualize events of the movie in fairly interesting ways. However, I do feel the comic lacks a little bit in some of the more emotional aspects of the story, but that being said, I think it is well crafted and does an interesting job of adapting the story and making you see it in a different light. Let me know down in the comments what you guys thought of this adaptation. I'm Brennan for the New Wave Nerds. Subscribe down below for more nerd content and commentary. Now let's roll the intro. Star Wars Rogue One comic adaptation is written by Jody Houser and penciled by Bazaldua and Emilio Laiso, and the Star Wars Rogue One Cassian K-2S0 Special is written by Duane Swierczynski and penciled by Fernando Blanco. Now, non-spoiler reviews, I'm going to start by saying here that I think the adaptation is fairly good. It's very fun. I think it does a good job of adapting what is a great story in the movie. However, I feel like the book itself doesn't necessarily live up to the epic proportions of the movie. I think the story in some cases, and this is a complaint of the movie and the comic, is sort of lacking in some moments. Obviously, I love the film, but it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And I think the film itself is helped by the direction of Gareth Edwards and the director of photography there. And the comic book obviously does not quite have that benefit. Like I mentioned in the opening, it does add some deleted scenes that are interesting to see, add some additional context, and the repositioning of certain things, I think, does a good job of recontextualizing what's going through the characters' minds in, whatever point in the story. Now, there are some things that are taken out of the comic book to make it fit into this 6-issue arc, 5 of which are only 23 pages, and with the first one being like 30-something. So you're kind of condensing this movie, but some of the lines, some of the scenes that were omitted, I felt like might actually be kind of important to the story, right? So I just rewatched the Rogue One movie after I finished Andor Season 2, our review of which just went live Tuesday, so go check that out. And, the movie opens, this isn't a spoiler, like I said, it's in like the first 10 minutes, but the movie opens with Andor on the Ring of Kafrene meeting with his informant from Saw Gerrera's band, Tivik. And he gets the information, learns, or rather, I guess after Andor sort of relearns, or the information is reinforced, I guess, that the Empire is building a planet killer. And there's an interaction with the stormtroopers, and the scene ends with Cassian shooting his informant Tivik and then climbing up a ladder to escape the Imperial stormtroopers. Now, in the comic book, you don't get the scene where Cassian grabs the informant behind the back and says, "Don't worry, it's going to be okay," and then shoots him. And you also don't get the moment immediately afterwards. In the movie, there's this, it's just like a 5-second little delay where Cassian just pauses and looks around. Sort of, and the implication is maybe that he's considering if what he did was the correct choice, if he made the right move here. I think that scene is kind of important in the movie itself, because the implication from that point forward is that Cassian is kind of like this cold-blooded guy, this sort of the man who's going to do whatever it takes to get the job done. And that aspect of the character is really hampered in the comic adaptation, because like I said, we don't get the scene where Cassian basically second guesses himself. And I think that that's an important moment because it does sort of humanize Cassian. It's this sort of moment where it's like, yes, he's going to do the things that he needs to do. He's an assassin, he's a spy, but he's not ambivalent, maybe. He's not apathetic. It's not like this doesn't affect him. It's still a difficult task to do, but he does it because it's what needs to be done. I feel like that is sort of lost in the comic adaptation, but it is served to the character really well in the series. So yeah, there are some moments where I question why what was left out, why what was why what was added. Sorry, that was a very weird sentence. But I think it does a decent job. I think it does a decent job. Now, as far as the Cassian and K-2S0 Special goes, again, this is still non-spoilers, I don't think it's very good, to be honest with you. I don't think it's a very well-written comic. I don't think it works very well narratively. It's an origin for K-2S0, an origin that has been retconned, thankfully, in Andor Season 2, and it's been redone in a much more interesting way. But my main complaint with this series, or rather this one-shot, this single issue, is that it doesn't feel like Cassian. Right now, obviously, I'm looking back on this with sort of a different view because now we've seen 2 seasons of Andor. We know more about this character. But even if you're just looking at it from the standpoint of the Rogue One movie, and if you put yourself in a time where Andor hasn't come out, so there's just the Rogue One movie, and that's all that we've seen of the character, and then you read the comic, I think you would still be like, this doesn't feel like that. This doesn't feel like him. This just feels like, standard rebel. This feels like an average rebel spy. I mean, he doesn't even feel like a spy per se. It just feels like average rebel asset. I don't know. But let's get into it a little bit more in the spoiler section. But before we do that, I'm going to very politely ask you all to head on over to patreon.com/newwavenerds. We really like doing this, and we hope that you guys like doing it. If you enjoy the content that we do here and want to help us make these videos look even better, we're in the same boat with you. And if you want to help us out and make it so that it's possible to keep doing these and make everything better, head on over to Patreon. We've got lots of different subscriber tiers, each with their own bit of benefits. And we're doing a Patreon drive. If we get to 15 new subscribers or $50 a month, you can join for as little as $3. Whichever of those prerequisites comes first, we're going to be doing a special 12-part series. That's right, 12 parts, where we go through DC's classic comic series, Crisis on Infinite Earths, issue by issue, going over the story, giving our thoughts, maybe talking about ways that it could be adapted in the future. I don't know. But you'll have to wait and see. And if you want to see, then again, you'll have to head on over to patreon.com/newwavenerds. Now, let's get into the spoiler section here. Let's first talk about the Cassian and K-2S0 Special, because obviously it's an origin for K-2S0, so it happens before the events of Rogue One. Now, I'm going to try to not go too deep into spoilers for Andor Season 2. Again, check out that review that went live on Tuesday. It only ended like a week and a half, little less than that, a week ago. And so I don't want to spoil anything too much, but I'm just going to say this. The origin for K-2S0 in the series is so much better. It's infinitely better. And we don't even really get to see it all that much. We don't get to see it all that much. But the way that they come into possession of the body, I guess, of K-2S0, the way that they reintegrate him into, or rather they break him from Imperial programming, is much better done. His role in this show is much better. But in this series, again, my biggest complaint is that it just doesn't feel like Cassian. Again, it just feels like random generic intel agent. It feels like you could take off the name Cassian, put anybody in there, and it would probably be a better story. Just because, again, it's so different from what we saw. It's so different from the way that he's portrayed in Rogue One. It's obviously different from the way that he's portrayed in Andor. But again, that's a bit of a hindsight thing. Again, if you just go off of the movie and read this book, I think you would be like, okay, well, that's not Cassian. It just doesn't make sense. There are some interesting things about this little one-shot, though. We get the introduction of these two other rebel agents who I think are actually kind of interesting. Their names are, let me see if I can zoom in here. Curtis and Rismore, I think. I don't know how. They're aliens, so I'm probably completely pronouncing that wrong. Um, I think the concept, this alien is kind of interesting. It's weird, okay? It is definitely weird. They're two aliens. They have purple skin, and they don't communicate by speaking. They're mostly nonverbal. The way that they communicate is by altering the pheromones that they exude, and that's how they communicate, which I think is an interesting idea. I don't know, like, I wouldn't say it's my favorite concept for an alien, period, let alone what we've seen in Star Wars. Um, but I think it's an interesting idea, and it does make for an interesting moment later on where Cassian, in like his inner monologue, is sort of describing these two, and he says, it's something along the lines of, sometimes I'll ask one of them a question, I'll ask them a question, and then I'll catch a whiff of ozone, and I'll realize that they just had a whole conversation. I think that's a pretty cool moment, and again, I think it's a cool idea, but it is certainly weird. It is certainly weird, and I really don't. I'm not a big fan of the interactions between Cassian and those two writ large. But again, that's mostly just because of the fact that nothing that he does really feels like Cassian. I do like, however, as far as K-2S0 goes, that we do sort of keep the same general tone. In the way that Cassian is not the way that we see him in the movie, I think K-2S0 is much closer to his introduction. K-2S0 is a great character, a great droid. I would have liked to have seen more of him, and I hope we get to go back in the comics at some point and see more of his adventures with Cassian. I think that would be fun. They're a really great pairing. K2 is probably my favorite droid that they've introduced in like a post, I suppose in like a post George Lucas era. I think he's probably my favorite. I enjoy him more than the one that we see in it must be Solo, I suppose, with what's his face? Lando Calrissian, the the droid who eventually becomes the ship. I like K2 a lot more than I like BB-8. I don't know. I'm just not a huge fan of BB-8. He's cute, I get it, but I don't know. It feels like they played a little bit too much off of him, and he didn't feel nearly as integral to me as like R2 does in the original and prequel trilogies. When they did BB-8, it was one of those moments where I was like, okay, well, it's a Star Wars thing, and so you have to have a droid. And to me, BB-8 felt like he was designed solely so that they could like sell toys and stuff off him, which again is not like, it's not like that's unique to Star Wars. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's the origin of Boba Fett too. I'm fairly certain. I could be wrong about that. I know that he was supposed to be like a nothing character, and then he's like massive because he just looks so cool. My dad loves to tell that story. He could probably illustrate it a little better than me. But I really enjoy K-2S0. And again, I think he's probably the only interesting part of this comic book. Trying to see him break free of the Imperial programming. I more or less, I think this one shot would have been better served. And this is a problem that I have with lots of things. I mean, I think if you're going to do a single issue, it needs to be longer than like 23 pages. If it's going to be a completely contained story in all this, I just think, you need to go for, 36 at least, if you're just doing the one, I guess this has 27 issues. So it would be, 27 pages. So it is a little bit closer to that number. But I feel like if you're doing a one shot, it needs to be sort of like extended, because you're only going to have this one place to go in the story. I definitely wouldn't recommend the Cassian and K-2S0 special, to be honest with you. especially considering now it doesn't even matter because we have a different origin for K2SO. I just don't think that it's written very well. I don't think the dialogue is good. I don't think the narrative is very fun. I don't think the story is interesting enough. But let's switch over to talking about the actual Rogue One adaptation. Like I mentioned, there are some included scenes that were in the original draft of the script, I believe, but were chopped off due to time, continuity, whatever reasons. And some of those are added in here, and I do think that they're pretty interesting. So really early on, we get a scene where it's actually the beginning of the interaction between Galen Erso and Bodhi Rook. This is where Galen convinces Bodhi to defect and to bring information to Saw Gerrera. You know, the moment that sort of begins the story of this movie. We get to see what happens right before that. And I think it's a really, really interesting interaction between the two of them. And of course, I'm a little bit biased here because, that character is played by Mads Mikkelsen. And so in my head, I read it as though it were Mads Mikkelsen saying it to me. And the actor is great and the character is great. So being able to see more of him is really fun. Additionally, Bodhi Rook, played by, I think, Riz Ahmed in the movie, is a really interesting character. It was just a fun thing, and I felt like it was one of the few additions that actually added something to the story here. Yes, it's Riz Ahmed. There were other moments where there were additions that I felt like didn't necessarily add much. Like, for example, in the movie, after Bodhi is taken in by Saw Gerrera's band of rebel extremists, he is interrogated, and Saw says to bring in Borg Gullet, which is, I suppose, this like alien octopus squid thing who can like read minds, I suppose. I guess. I don't know. He puts his suckers on you, and then he learns your thoughts. In the comic, we actually do get to see like what that experience is kind of like for Bodhi Rook. There are like 4 different panels where I would imagine that Borg Gullet is like prying through Bodhi's minds to sort of mind singular to get through and see what is true and see what is not. I think that's an interesting idea, but I feel like it doesn't really add any context to the story. I feel like it doesn't necessarily add anything. It feels like it doesn't inform anything about Bodhi's character. In some ways, it just feels like a thing that was added because they were like, well, what would he see? But again, it doesn't necessarily add anything to the story. I think if you're going to do something like that and include something that isn't in the movie, it's supposed to add to the movie, right? Like I mentioned earlier, that beginning scene between Bodhi and Galen Erso, I feel like that does add context to the movie. It does sort of explain a little bit more of Galen's thought process, of Bodhi's actions and all this, how people get from point A to point B. I don't think this does that. I don't think so. But another interesting, it's not an addition, more of like a revision, is that when Jyn Erso, Cassian Andor, K2SO are going to go to Jeddah so that they can meet with Saw and get the information from this pilot that is obviously going to lead to them heading to Scarif. In the movie, Jyn Erso boards the plane, or the ship, and Cassian is called aside by General Draven, who says, you're not going to rescue this guy. He's got too much information. He's too important to the Empire. If you find him, you kill him. And we see it like that in the beginning, and then Cassian walks over to the ship, and they leave, right? In the comic, we don't see it in that order. It is, Cassian gets called aside, but then we see things just from Jin's perspective. Cassian walks into the ship later. K2 asks in the same as the movie, he says, why does she get a blaster and I don't? Yada, yada, yada. Cassian lets her keep it. And K2 says, do you know what the probability of her using that against you is? Or do you want to know or something? And he says, no. or he says, let's get going or whatever. And K2 says in the movie, he just goes, it's high. It's very high. And it's immediately after that. But in the comic, the first time he says it's high, the next panel is Cassian's face like covered in shadows. And then the right side of it is General Draven telling Cassian that if he gets the opportunity to kill Galen Erso. And then we cut back to the ship and K2 says it's very high for the second time. I think that's really interesting. And that was another way of like sort of recontextualizing that moment. Like it's the exact same scenes, but sort of reordered in a way that this, I feel, does humanize Cassian a little bit more. You know, I mentioned in the beginning that I feel like we miss out on a moment that humanizes him. I think this sort of fills that gap a little bit. It's a natural thing to do. That's what you would be thinking, right? Because now he's like, okay, I'm going to kill this lady's dad. I'm giving her, or rather, I'm letting her keep a blaster. If she finds out, she's going to kill me because she doesn't even want to be here in the first place. You know, it's sort of reluctant that she's involved in this. I think it's interesting. I do think there are some additions that make the story more fun, but by and large, I don't know if those additions make up for the fact that the comic book loses a lot of the epic nature of the story that you get from the movie. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the art by Jan Bazaldua. I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry. And Emilio Laiso. I don't know. I'm sure they're very lovely people, and I'm sure some people like their art style. I just don't. It's not for me. It's sort of, it treads this weird line where it's like trying to recreate the faces of the actors from the movie, but not quite. I don't know. It's weird. One thing that I will say about this comic series, and I had forgotten until just now, is that the cover art is really, really good. They are all by Phil Noto, I don't know, but I really, really like it. I mean, I would hazard to say almost all of these covers are cool enough that they would be fun posters to have. Like specifically the one for issue number 1 and issue number 6, issue number 4. Those are really, really interesting. I love the way that those look. I love the composition of them. And they are really, really cool. So yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting story. Again, final thoughts, like the story itself is good. Reading the comic, I did feel for some reason sort of accentuated some of what some people have described as plot holes in the movie. I don't necessarily know if I would call them plot holes, but it's fine. I love watching that movie. And like I mentioned earlier, after I finished Andor Season 2, I went straight into Rogue One. And then after that, I went straight into A New Hope. That is a crazy viewing experience. I mean, it's so interesting. It's so cool to see all of these laid out in quick succession. I mean, granted, you know, as far as Andor Season 2 goes, it's only the last 3 episodes that take place immediately before the events of Rogue One. But it's really, really cool. I mean, that would be a really fun marathon to do, like on a weekend or whatever. Assuming you've already seen the rest of the show, do the last 3 episodes of Andor Season 2 directly into Rogue One, directly into A New Hope. That's really cool. It's such a fun experience, and I love the way that, like, I mean, Star Wars is so interesting in the sense that, like, I feel like in large part, they do retcons really well. You know, it's such a massive expansion. It's such a massive universe. I feel like they do a really good job of going back and adding stuff and weaving it into the story, especially with something like, say, the Clone Wars and with Rebels. I think it's done really, really well. And I can't wait to see more stuff in this era. I love Andor. He's such a cool character, obviously amazingly played by Diego Luna. I'm sort of getting back into Star Wars. For a long time, I wasn't that necessarily into Star Wars. I'd taken a long hiatus. I shouldn't say I wasn't into it because I still loved it, but I just wasn't in the mood for any of it. But after watching Andor Season 2 and reading and watching Rogue One and now A New Hope, it's making me want to go back and dive back into it. It really is. It's such an expansive universe, and it'll always hold, a special place in my heart because it was one of those first nerd franchises that I truly, truly loved. I think I loved Star Wars before I loved Marvel and before I loved DC. I could be wrong about that because I was a child, so I don't necessarily remember. But I remember being in like elementary school, and our elementary school library used to have like this like Star Wars reference book or whatever. And, I would check that out and sit in, man, that must have been like my second grade classroom. I think that was the second grade classroom. I don't know. In any case, me and my buddies would just look over that book and be so interested and so excited. And I do think that's before I was really into DC and Marvel. By that point, I'd probably seen some movies and probably been interested, but I didn't love anything as much as I loved Star Wars. Now I think it's flipped. It's interesting. I still love Star Wars, but I think I'm definitely much more of a DC guy than I am a Star Wars fan now. I don't know. That'd be an interesting thing to think about and figure out where my loyalties lie, as they will, with the Rebel Alliance or with the Justice League. I don't know. We'll see. But I think, we're going to call it there. I don't know if it's a necessary read. I think it's fine enough. If you're interested, then go ahead. It's not a waste of time. It's more enjoyable than the Thunderbolt series that we reviewed last week. But in any case, let's see. Let me take a look at the schedule here. Next Tuesday, the summer of Superman begins at the New Wave Nerds here. We're going to take a look at Superman the movie from 1978, the movie that made you believe that a man could fly, the movie that started it all. I'm so excited. I love that movie so, so much. It holds such a special place in my heart, and I'm really excited to watch it again. I think this is the first time. This is like maybe the fifth or sixth time that I've seen the movie itself, but I think this is going to be the first time where I actually like look at it as a movie instead of like as a Superman thing. I'm going to try and take myself out of it and review it as unbiased as possible, and I'm really, really excited. And then next Thursday, we're going to be back here to talk about the Superman 78 comic series. This is the continuation of Christopher Reeve. It's a 12-issue series, and it's really fun. It's actually pretty good so far. So I'm really excited to talk about it. But that's where we're going to leave it. Make sure that you like and subscribe so that you don't miss another video. Comment down below. Let me know if you think that the comic adaptation does a good job of adapting the movie. I don't know. I'm a little iffy on it, but let me know your thoughts. And again, if you like the work we do here and want to make these videos even better, then go on over to patreon.com/newwavenerds and help support us and, get a little stuff coming back your way. Get a few benefits, definitely get, a fun 12-part series. That's going to be a whole half a day's worth, minimum of content. I'm excited. I hope you're excited. But in any case, for that, we will have to wait. I will see you guys on Tuesday to talk about